first of all, thanks very much to the museum here for inviting me. During COVID, there was a number of times where we would have, the opportunity to present by Zoom, and more recently, we started to do it in person. But certainly for this audience here, it was a great opportunity and a chance for us to, not only brag about the Brooks Steam Car, but also to talk a little bit about some of the history that goes with it. It starts right here on the first slide, and we'll refer to a bit of this later. This is one of the iconic photos of the Brooks Steam Car factory, and we've had a number of people, when we talk about the Brooks Steam Car and the relation to the museum, they think this is a picture of it in front of the museum. In fact, this was often referred to as the Trow Mansion, which was right around the corner from the Brooks Steam Car factory, which was on Terrace Street. Trow Avenue is just at the corner, and this is a great big mansion that backs onto the Avon River, and it's adjacent to where the Stratford Festival is now. It's very close. This is as much as this is sort of the iconic photo of the Brooks Steam Car and its history. It speaks to the history of the car itself. As we're going to see in a number of slides, there's a great question about the Brooks Steam Car as to how real was it? Was it was it a scam? Was it a legitimate business enterprise? The one thing we do know was that it was a marvelous marketing example in how someone took a vehicle and a product that may have had no place in mainstream society and was able to garner a whole lot of money towards its production. And it was images like this that helped promote the car to that end. And that's, I think, a fitting cover photo, as it were, for our Brooks Steam Car. And by the way, this is not our Brooks Steam Car. This is a different model. As far as the Stratford Perth Museum goes, we inherited the car from the Stratford Perth Heritage Foundation. They created a capital campaign in 2005 through 2007 to raise $50,000 to acquire this Brooks Steam Car from the Aurelia Heritage Center. The background of that is that the Aurelia Heritage Center wanted to sell the car for do other things that were more specific to their mandate and to their area. The irony here is that when the Stratford Heritage Foundation acquired the car in 2007, the Stratford Perth Museum didn't really have a permanent home. It has had a nomadic existence dating back to the early 1900s. It was at the Stratford Library. It was at 162 King Street. It was in a building called the Discovery Center next door to the Stratford Festival. And the museum didn't get its own home, its own permanent location until 2009. And at that point, the museum became a very logical place for the Brooks Steam Car to be stored and to be put on display. As I said, I started at the museum in 2013. In 2014, we had a little bit of a ceremony where the Stratford Perth Heritage Foundation turned the car over full-time to the museum for us to curate it and look after it. And one of the cool things about that was we literally had the keys. And the Stratford Perth Heritage Foundation gave us the keys. We took some pictures, and then the car went into what we called our large storage area. And in addition to the car itself, that foundation had a number of documents and pictures, which also became part of the museum collection and helped contribute to the exhibit itself. The car we have, to give a little bit of background in it, it was one of the very last cars produced. It was car number 26056. It was not the 2,656 or the 26,000 car that had been produced. We'll talk more about that later, but it was one of the last cars produced. It was built at the 500 Ontario Street Stratford factory. It was bought at the bankruptcy auction in 1931. We don't know what this car was sold for, but we do know when we go through the bankruptcy records that cars at that event, completed running cars, were selling for as little as $150. The car we have is restored and in good shape, but I can tell you that it's not roadworthy. It was acquired when it's had a number of owners since the bankruptcy. And in the 1990s, it was purchased by a guy named Gordon Smith from Walkerton, Ontario. He did a lot of restoration on it. He restored the colors to their original state. For example, here you see it had black fenders. He painted the wheels to the original color. He painted the fenders back to black. When he acquired it, the fenders were actually white. So there's a bit of a restoration took place. I can tell you that there are no plans to restore the vehicle to the point where it's operable. The Stratford Perth Museum has a couple of other steam engines, and we have allowed those to go out of what we call a commissioned state into a decommissioned state. For example, we had a steam engine that we would take in parades and so on. It's about $1,500 a year to have a steam engine, which the Brooks has, to have it certified and have it maintained. And that's if there's no problems with it. The other issue for us is part of our insurance policy was that you would also have to store the vehicle off-site. And in doing so, we wouldn't be able to have the vehicle on display at the museum if it was fully operable. We have had a number of people come forward, as I say, lift up the hood and say, can we take a look at this? We'd like to restore the vehicle. We'd like to get it running. Later in the slideshow, you'll see an example of someone who actually did get one of the Brooks, running as well. That's a rough outline of the car that we have and how it came to be at the museum, and a little bit of description of the model that we have in Stratford. Here is a picture of our Brooks steam car, and to coin a phrase or use a museum terminology, it's in situ. And that is Latin for it's in the situation that we felt would best reflect its exhibit status at the museum. As I said, the room that it's in, our large theater, our cooperators theater, when we got the car, it was a storage space, and we had farm equipment there. And in 2016, we converted it into a theater where we show, for example, documentaries that would augment our exhibits, etc. So during COVID, the museum was closed for an extensive period, as were just about every museum in the country. And we were closed for 55 of 92 weeks, beginning in March of 2020, same as the rest of the Western world, of course. Different for us was that the Stratford Festival, a huge employer, which at its peak has about 1,000 employees, had a very robust scenic painting division, set division, and props division. The federal government came up with a number of grants to employ or to give people projects to work on where they could pay them in lieu of CERB or in lieu of unemployment. We took advantage of that, and we got a nice grant from the federal government, and we hired a person named Michelle Jameson. So what you see in this vision or in this picture is the vision that the museum and by extension Michelle shared, and our manager of the collection, Michaela Fitzsimmons, as to a appropriate display setting for the Brooks steam car. So what this is a replica of the indoors of the factory at 500 Ontario Street. We took historic pictures, pulled a number of elements out of those historic pictures, including the windows, including the piping, and we integrated the 3 storyboards into the display, which you can see to the left. Over and above that, we went to an old factory in Stratford, took a picture of the floor, and replicated the floor for the Brooks steam car as well. So, as I often said during COVID, we tried to make the best possible use of our time. And when we were closed, and I think this is probably the shining example of that, where we created a fitting display and backdrop for our Brooks. So the Brooks history in Stratford, as during COVID, one of the things that I did, as Alex mentioned, I had a history. My first career was as a journalist. I have degrees in English and majors in English and history. So as I was at the Stratford Perth Museum for weeks at a time, often by myself, I decided to do a lot of work towards the creation of these storyboards and to really begin to tell the story about the Brooks and the history of Stratford. So I can tell you that it was in 1923 that the idea was floated by the Brooks Finance Company. And it was a company that specialized in second mortgages and third mortgages and what they called risky industrial loans. That company went through a number of changes. There was a company called Trask, which was in the same business. And through a number of mergers or purchases, we ended up with the Brooks Steam Car Factory. It moved to Stratford in 1924. And the idea was, and the projection was, that it was going to be a massive employer. At the time, the huge employer in Stratford was the CNR Railway Repair Yards, or as they're called in Stratford, colloquially referred to as the shops. So a huge factory, 1 million square feet, downtown Stratford, at one point over 1,000 employees. And this was going to, be a huge addition to the Stratford industrial landscape. They talked about 500 employees. They had grand plans. They had 3 models of cars they were going to build. They were also going to build trucks. They were going to build buses. And a lot of it was based on the success or the operational model of the Stanley Steemer. What eventually ended up happening was that over 8 years, they built a total of 174 cars. And that works out to, if you do the math, it's less than 2 a month. A lot of the cars that were built, as we did research on them, they were almost what we would refer to as model homes. There was certainly an idea that they would sell them, but the vast majority that were made in the first couple of years were used for promotion. A couple were driven across the country and sort of were publicity stunts. They were used in photos. They were used in stockholder meetings. And particularly, they were used for investment meetings where they would invite well-heeled people from Stratford as well as Southern Ontario and the rest of the province to come to lavish dinners. They would tour the factory. They would see all these cars being built. And the cynic in us would say that really they were, for the most part, used as props. Which leads us to the next theory about the Brooks steam car. And I will preface it by saying that it is a theory, but it's one that is not without its justification. And there is lots of speculation to suggest that Oland Brooks never really saw this as a viable business, and that it was as we refer to in these days, sort of a stock scam. If we use Stratford terminology, and it's famous for its Stratford Festival, for those of you that have seen The Music Man, where Harold Hill comes into River City and he convinces city politicians that this is a great idea, and he engages the community, and this is going to change the community, and one of the things he talked about was the city of Stratford would be the only place in Canada that had 0 unemployment, that anybody that wanted a job would have a job. In this article, and when I came across this magazine called Man's World, and it's a sort of a comic book magazine, to be honest, but it had an incredible investigative journalist article in there about the Brooks steam car and its presence in Stratford and what transpired there. And again, making the best of COVID, or the best of a terrible situation, poured through that comic book, as it were, made all sorts of notes, and that was really led to a lot of the core of our middle panel. There was 3, our middle story panel, which talked about Stratford's steamy scandal, or as the headline of the article calls it, Brooks Steamer, the car that ran on hot air. A couple of things I can say is that the article talked about how Oland Brooks was a particularly articulate man, and he had one of his great skills was taking money from people. And it was far more eloquent to that, but said he had a mastery of separating money from well-intended people or people who had great aspirations and were driven by greed and riches. His company, the Brooks Finance Company, when it went to trial and went to bankruptcy, if we think about how life sort of repeats itself, and we think about watching CNN last week or this week or next week, there's a lot of talk about Donald Trump and where he has been indicted for submitting a false business plan and for borrowing money against a company or companies and far inflating their value. So the world sort of does repeat itself, I think. We go through cycles. And Oland Brooks, during trial, it was concluded that he had inflated the value of his company by about 800%. Over and above that, again, similar to Donald Trump, he managed not to go to jail, but his auditor went to jail. And at the end of the day, the allegations was, and they are allegations, of course, was that he had swindled about $4 million in 1920s money. I know that there's some people on this call who may be from Stratford or Stratford area. And if we think that we have great, in the Stratford area, if we have great misgivings about municipal management and giving money to factories or propping up businesses or loaning the money, I can tell you not to worry. This is not a new phenomenon. The city of Stratford helped arrange a banquet of 200 well-heeled people, including the Economic Development Committee, and also chipped in a tidy sum of $50,000 that they gave to the Brooks factory in order to help it land in Stratford and to convince it not to go somewhere else, because this was going to be a huge difference maker for the Stratford economy and well as the Stratford community. So I present exhibits A, B, and C for the promotional videos, which now, as we look back at these, we can look at these through a different lens. Bottom right, I talked about the idea that this car was sitting in front of this house. And what's the suggestion here? That the person in that house bought that car. And this great mansion in Stratford, and the first thing the guy did was buy this car. Top left, you can see the cars rolling out bumper to bumper. I look at that and I say, that looks like a picture of one of those famous Henry Ford pictures of Dearborn, Michigan, where cars are rolling out one after another in an assembly line that is just hammering cars out, where the people that are buying, they can barely keep up to the orders. Keep in mind that in the first year, and this is when this was taken, and the mayor is standing by the door to add more credibility. In the first year, the company sold 18 cars. So I'm not sure there's a need to roll them out like this when you're really making one about every 3 weeks or so. Over and above that, the picture in the top right, I'm an English major. I work in a museum. I worked in a newspaper before that, but I've been in lots of factories, and that doesn't look like a functioning factory to me. It's pretty clean, no tools, guys in suits, even the people working there in suits. And it looks pretty pristine. So not that we can retry this case in 2023, but I think these three pictures here would lead one to believe that maybe this wasn't all it was said to be. Now, being the impartial journalist I am, we can speculate, or was it a legit idea? Was it a legit venture? And it just became victim of a number of badly timed things, or was it a legit idea and a terrible one? Submitted for consideration, I would say off the top of that speculation is the Brooks steam car that we have at the Stratford Perth Museum was listed for $3,885 in 1924. That was the selling price. At the same time, the Model T was around $300. So the Model T in 1924 was $300. The Brooks steam car was $3,885. To put that in comparison, And to speculate or to extend out how ridiculous that was to try and sell a car in that market is the 1965 Mustang. And in this audience, I think there'd be some interest in that and its place in history. The Lee Iacocca 64.5, 65 Mustang was still cheaper than the Brooks Steam car. Its list price was $24.27. So it was $1,400 cheaper than the Brooks Steam car, sort of 40 years later, roughly. Top speed of the Brooks Steam car was 35 miles an hour, which was not terrible. But one thing is that I think it would, one of the obstacles to great consumer demand, it took 30 minutes to warm up. It took 26 steps to start it and to get it to the point where it would move. And one thing it does not talk about, it was inherently dangerous, that it ran under pressurized steam. And while that was one of the obstacles to the demise of steam as it started to disappear, is that there is some obvious danger to running a vehicle that's powered by a steam boiler. Over and above that was the overall demise of steam. And then, of course, as Oland Brooks would say, this wasn't a bad idea. It just was all killed by the Great Depression of 1929 and the Black Thursday, and destroyed not only this industry but lots of others. One thing that we had when we did acquire the car, we ended up with a lot of people that began to reach out to us. Private collections, not just in Stratford, but in many areas. And we started to be flooded with documents and artifacts, pictures, and some of these were terrific. And again, similarly, you look at these two pictures, the factory on the bottom right, you've got all these cars lined up, all ready to be shipped across the country, across North America. But the one thing that comes to mind is there's no workers. There's no one here. And the picture above, there's 2 or 3 people that are standing around, and the guy in the second car sort of looks like he's working on something, but a lot of these cars seem to be in the same state of production. So these are a couple of the photos that are in our collection as well and are part of the exhibit. These were the promotional photos, and as I often say, the photo at the bottom, and again for this audience in particular, if we look at that picture that we had before where the car's rolling out the front, or this picture here, I think we've tried to replicate what would be sort of the Packard factory in Detroit, where you've got hundreds and maybe 1,000 people, and cars are just pouring out of this place. Certainly, I think that's the impression that you get here, is that it's a very modern factory, and your production is just pouring out here, and business is good. Technically, I thought I would include a couple of these photographs as well. One thing I can say, for photos that were taken in the 1920s, they used a particular camera with a great big negative, quite often a 4-inch by 4-inch negative, and you ended up with incredible clarity. And the picture on the right in particular, for a picture that is 100 years old, the detail in it, I think, is absolutely amazing and fantastic, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to include it. It's also, the front end of the car is elevated, so that you can get a pretty good look at the drivetrain, more or less. And there may be people on this call that appreciate the technical aspect of the vehicle. On the left-hand side is the lubrication chart. Similarly, for people that are interested in the real technical aspect of this and cars, for this audience, I thought we would include that as well, over and above the history element of this conversation. Similarly, here's a boiler, a cutaway boiler picture that someone gave us, and it actually was in some of the promotional material, as well as a cutaway version with the hood off and the cabin off, so that you can see a little bit of the workings of the clutch, the gas tanks, etc., the wheels, and I can tell you that our boiler in ours does not look like that. Ours was painted gray, and as part of the restoration process, but this would be the natural black from when it was in the factory and went from where it was fabricated. Here's a couple of other documents we have. A terrific manual, which is you know, it doesn't think about what we think of when we think of manuals. But I thought one of the cool things about the cover was the adoption or adaptation of two other steam transportation mainstays that appear in the background. Of course, that's a steam locomotive train that's whistling across a railway bridge, and also a steamboat, steamship that's going under the archway of the same bridge. I thought it was a very almost Harlequin romance type cover for the manual for the Brooks steam car. Again, here's a couple of the technical sheets that were given to us that are on display in our museum as well. And for those that are planning on making a trip to the museum, or for anybody who wants these, I can certainly get these forwarded off to this group as well. And this is recorded as well. And we'd be glad to supply these to anybody. They're all scanned. They're very easy for us to send off. So if anybody has a real interest in the technical aspect of this, I'd be glad to share that as well. So as we talk about the technical aspect, when we do our walkthroughs of the museum, as a layperson, but a person who runs a museum, I often stop at this screen here and we walk around the back of the car. And I think about two things. I think number one, it's interesting that the car would be run on water and kerosene, but the pilot light would actually work off gasoline. So a bit of a combination, a potentially very deadly combination here, to be sure. And I often think when I look at the back of the car that there are two taps here that you can take off. One is for kerosene and one is for water. And I often think, and I often make a bit of a joke of this, I would mark those. They're not marked. There's no indication that one is kerosene, that one is water. And I thought the idea of mixing those up and making a mistake and putting the water in the kerosene or the kerosene in the water would have very problematic consequences. So that's one of the more light-natured elements that we post out when we do our walkthrough of the Brooks steam car for our groups that go through the museum. And finally, the history of the site itself is quite interesting in Stratford. It's 500 Ontario Street, and it was a property that after the Brooks steam car went into bankruptcy, became a very controversial property. You can see the Brooks factory there. It's right at the edge of the road. After the Brooks steam car factory went bankrupt and that building was torn down, there was another factory built on the property, and that property was quite controversial and from a municipal nature and sat vacant for almost 30 years. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that the family came along, the Buckingham family, and they built something called the Bruce Hotel. So the top left, obviously, is the Brooks steam car factory, again, with a long line of cars out front, a bunch of people posing for pictures. But as we said at the start of this call before the rest joined, it's sort of too bad that that factory wasn't saved, because today, that's exactly the sort of building that gets repurposed and turns into great housing, condominium buildings, high-end property. But one of the issues with it is it was right on the sidewalk of the busiest street in Stratford. So I'm not sure it could have been saved and returned. Again, the Bruce Hotel, a boutique hotel, very high-end, sits on the same property where the Brooks steam car factory used to sit. So having said all that, we have a bit of a treat here, and that is that part of this presentation, or I would say the promotion of this presentation and the advertising of it, ended up with someone sending me a video of a fully restored and running Brooks steam car. And this is from Victoria, BC. And it really caused some pause for me, because we have made a commitment, for what I think is good reasons, not to restore the Brooks steam car. We couldn't keep it in our building, etc. Insurance issues, certification issues, maintenance, and a person to operate it are all barriers. But this video is pretty cool. And I want to thank the people who sent this, who emailed this to me. And I also, the timing was perfect. And I talked to Alex here, and we were able to include it in our presentation tonight. So I hope this works, and I'm just going to play the video here. Okay, so that's a almost fully restored Brooks steam car, missing the doors and missing the hood, but I think that was pretty cosmetic, and I get the feeling that those are pretty handy, and that car is going to look in one piece within shortly after that video was taken. So that concludes my presentation about the Brooks steam car, but I'd obviously love to take some questions, and I'd make an attempt to answer them.
Sure. Thank you so much, John. A question that sort of occurred to me and sort of expanded on based on what you said. You mentioned that they were thinking about doing 3 different body types, and of course the Brooks was only ever sold as a sedan. Do we have any evidence of what those other 2 body types would have looked like, or of anybody, turning a Brooks into a coupe or a runabout with a custom body?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, if you go to in one of the panels, it talks about the 3 body types, and they were going to be the model you saw here, and then they were going to build 2 luxury sedans as well. And I don't know whether that was if that ever made it past promotional material, or if there's ever actually drawings or designs done. But this was going to be the base model, and then 2 other vehicles, and the most expensive one they were going to list at about $5,000. And then over and above that, they talked about trucks, and they also talked about buses.
Okay. It seems quite odd to me that in the era of small light Model Ts, why 3 sedans of all things?
Yeah, and not as we talked in one of the other about the actual weight of the vehicle and the size of it, that it was sort of the antithesis, and that lends itself to the theory that maybe this was just a bad idea, that or maybe it was both. It was not just there's 2 elements to it. There was a scam element to it, or maybe it was just a bad business idea, or maybe it was a bit of both.
So just to clarify a detail, this is coming in from Clark, one of our regulars. The steam car in the video that is missing doors as a safety measure, or because they're not restored yet? Do we know?
I don't know. My feeling was, looking at the rest of the car, I think that it was that they had got, and it's complete speculation on my part. My guess is they got the motor running, they got the drivetrain running. There was a bunch of work being on the car. They got it fired up with steam to test it, and they said, I'm going to take this for a drive now while we've got the steamer up to pressure, or the boiler up to pressure, and I'm going to take this for a drive. And not unlike when you finish a regular car, the last thing you may put on is the doors and the hood and sort of the cosmetic things. So I don't think there's anything to read into the idea that it didn't have the doors on. I think they got it fired up, and the guy said, I'm going to take this for a drive.
Okay. Jeff is asking about the chassis photo that you posted earlier, and he's fairly certain that is that the chassis of a Brooks car or of the Brooks bus? I was under the impression that the buses had only ever been made outside of Canada. But
Well,
can you speak a
yeah,
bit more to the bus?
I would not rule that out because I can't speak to the provenance of this photo. The one thing I can tell you why I think that Clark? Jeff may be right, is the fact that it's got dual wheels on the back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think that lends itself to Jeff's idea that may be a bus. Two things: the dual wheels, the length of the vehicle, and I thought that it was maybe a good idea to show that photo because it sort of showed a cutout and exposed drivetrain. I will say that really looks like the Stratford factory. It looks like a lot of the detail we had there, but I would agree that looks like a bus to me. And we have, in all the research we've done, our research told us that there was only ever cars made in Stratford. But that's not to say that, given the fact that they also owned a bus company, a bus fabrication place in Buffalo, that may have ended up at Stratford. But I would agree, that looks like a bus to me. The dual's on the back for sure.
Yeah. Jeff is also pointing out that on the bus, you can see the steam pistons are in the middle and it's got a differential in the back. Whereas on the oiling duct or the lubrication chart for the car, the engines are right up against the back
Right,
wheel.
up at the front, sure.
Now, Dennis wants to know a little bit about the sort of controls and the dashboard. What do you need to actually run a Brooks car? Because as I understand it, the process is nightmarishly complicated, at least for starting.
Yeah, so what we read in the manual was that there was I'm just trying to find there's a picture of ours. It talked about 26 steps to start it. And all we know is that, we had a number of steam people come in and start to look at valves and say, well, this is okay and that's okay, etc. But the dash itself, and I wish I had a picture of it. I think we have a number of pictures in the interior. I should have included that. But it is a traditional dash. It has a gear shift on the floor. I've sat in the vehicle a number of times. It's got a speedometer. It's got a pressure meter, which maybe a normal car doesn't have. But it's got, other than that, it looks like a car from any other car from the 1930s, 1940s. Under the hood, decidedly different for sure. But the dash itself is not noticeably different to a layperson like myself.
Okay. John's asking about the history of Stanley Steamers in the Stratford area, but I'm going to open this up. Would you be able to elaborate on how the patent situation worked? Because as I understand it, the Brooks is basically just the guts of a Stanley Steemer. Were they legally allowed to do that? Did they have to buy the rights? I forget if Stanley was even still around as a company at this point.
I can read exactly what we have off one of our storyboards as we talked about the inception of the Brooks presence in that industry, or the potential to become involved in an industry. When Oland Brooks arrived in Stratford in 1923, his purported plan was to produce an elegant, high-end steam-powered automobile. Recent advancements had been made in steam technology, and though the steam car industry was on the decline, Brooks was convinced that these new advancements would revive interest in the product. A financier from Buffalo, Brooks had moved to Toronto in 1919 and established Brooks Securities as a company that specialized in second mortgages and high-risk loans. This is the interesting part for this question. His interest in automobile production was sparked through an association with O.C. Trask, who in late 1922 was attempting to establish a new Canadian site for the Detroit Steam Motors Corporation. Automotive production was a burgeoning post-war industry in Canada, tens of thousands of cars built annually. Here's a reference to Stanley Steemer. Despite the falling popularity of the steam car, Trask was committed to the technology that produced a quiet, smooth-riding car. When he met Brooks, Trask was in the process of planning a 50,000 square foot Toronto plant to build 500 vehicles a year. Board of directors, and they raised $250,000 in money. In 23, Trask joined forces with Brooks The board was dissolved and Trask turned over his patents and other design improvements in exchange for 400,000 shares of the Brooks stock, and he got a position as vice president of the new company. Brooks Steam Motor Limited was established, and the proposed Toronto factory was then moved to Stratford. Over the course of 8 years, Trask's dream was never realized. Brooks Steam Motor went from a lofty claim of producing 3 different models of luxury cars, small trucks, and a fleet of buses, to the last of its elegant vehicles being sold for $150. So there was no reference to here except for this. In starting up, the initial proposal called for 200 cars to be built. The design was based on the Trask Detroit model, which itself was a derivative of the Stanley Steemer 740. Equipment and parts had to be purchased, employees needed to be hired, and therefore sufficient capital had to be raised. But there was a reference to Stanley in that, and also in that there was a reference where Trask, it would appear, had obtained the patents and also some of the intellectual property of Stanley, because it talks about how Trask had a relationship with Stanley Steemer, and then Trask ended up having a relationship with Brooks, and Brooks ended up swallowing up the Trask.
Okay.
I hope that, I'm not sure that answers the question, but it's the best I got.
It establishes some provenance, certainly. We've got a couple more comments from both Jeff and Mark. So apparently there is actually a second running Brooks in England. And Mark is saying that the running Brooks in BC, it's been operational for a few years, though it may have been recently refreshed. And apparently, as far as he knows, the body of the vehicle is all original. The boiler is new. And it's not a full restoration. The interior has not been restored, but the engine components have. So a little bit of context on that runner.
That's nice, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just clearing up some questions here. This might actually be an interesting question, because your museum's Brooks is in much nicer shape than ours. What can you say about the skin of the car? Because it's quite an unusual vehicle in that regards.
So I'm just going to go to this other frame that I can talk about that. I've got this here, and it is I can tell you exactly what was done, and it was done by.
Because it's not metal, it's fabric.
No, it's fabric with lacquer is what it's really like. It's it's fabric with lacquer. So I can tell you what happened there. So just to give you a little bit of the history, the car was after the bankruptcy sale. The car was located in the Welland area, and it sat in storage there during until after World War II. In 1945, it was purchased by a man named Ian Wills of Toronto, who restored it to what he referred to as working condition. He did, however, paint the body brown and the fenders white. In 1998, it was purchased by Gordon Smith of Hanover, and he began the restoration process. He passed it on to his son, John, and then eventually the Aurelia Historical Society. And it was there in Aurelia that they had built the box. They had built the box. They had built the cab, as it was. They rebuilt the boiler, father and son from Walker, and they rebuilt the boiler, acquired new tires, and repainted the car to its original black color. He also re-nickeled and chromed the condenser frame, the headlights, and the bumper. 2004 went to storage again, etc. I can tell you that the surface of it itself, and as much as we have a museum where we like people to be able to touch things, we always caution people. You can see the little red sign here, please don't touch a car. The surface of the vehicle, not the metal part, not the hood, not the fenders, but the cabin itself, everything from the windshield back is almost like a fabric or a fiberglass that has lacquer on it. And on a couple of occasions, we've had sort of, loony sized pieces of paint that would fall off and would just fall off. And we've managed to sort of keeping respect for the age of the vehicle and to replicate it accordingly and appropriately, we've always had great, our manager collection sort of works to repair it, the best we can without compromising it. But yes, the body is very, very odd. It has a steel frame, steel windows, etc., or steel frames around the windows, steel door handles and trim. But the panels themselves are this fabric with coats and coats of lacquer.
Going back to another question from Clark, you'd mentioned that it's got a flip-out windshield. Wouldn't that be a little dangerous in the event of a hypothetical boiler explosion, having the front of the car on a hinge?
I can tell you that you can see the window here. We always have the window flipped open. And if you look closely at this one, you can see that there's two flip out windows. One, there's a vent at the bottom that's a sort of a 45-degree angle. And the second window flips open as well. And you can turn it ahead a little bit. I think you can pick that up just a bit. I can tell you, I'm not sure, as I mentioned, the idea of the two caps at the back, one for kerosene and one for water. And I think today we'd want those marked like you do with diesel and leaded and unleaded. And I'm not sure that this speaks to the idea of how serious were the designers of this, that this was going to be a mainstream, popular, and consumer-driven product. Because if it was, maybe that's some of the things you would have fixed. And I think during that process that we don't really need to. We're only going to sell a couple hundred of these anyways.
Certainly in the research on our Brooks, the general impression I got from the startup portion of the manuals that you sent us was that you were much more likely to set your car on fire than you were to blow it up.
Right.
Yeah.
As one person said to me, as we talked to our insurance agent, we had an insurance agent on our board, and we talked about storing into the building. He says, we've got great apprehension to have what amounts to a rolling bomb in the building. He said,
a question about sales. A question from Dennis asking if there are any Brooks steamers sold in the Montreal area. And I'm intrigued about this because in our research, we've certainly found that for a while, Montreal seems to have been kind of a hub of steam car use in Canada. So do we know if there are Brooks sold outside of the Stratford area? How far did they get?
You would have a much better chance of somebody on this call would likely somebody that's called in to know that more than I. All I know is the provenance of this one and the idea that it was Aurelia, which was curious. It's a little bit unusual for museums to sell things.
I meant historically, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you would know as well that quite often you designate things for what we call deaccessioning, and you give them to another museum. But I think there was the idea that there was an historical connection to Aurelia because of the cabin or the cab. But I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know any more than I've in the last 3 weeks I've learned more about. Well, it's during COVID. I learned a lot about this car, but I don't have any idea about Montreal or anything like that.
Jeff, our resident Brooks technical expert, is commenting that apparently there's never been any recorded case of a Stanley type steam boiler exploding. Apparently the sort of pressure relief systems on them are very good. Dennis is wondering, back to the previous question about sales, sort of original sales in the 1920s. Do we have factory records for whether any of these cars were shipped outside of Ontario in the 1920s? Were they sold outside of Stratford when the factory was still technically running? Do we know anything about that?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Demerrick, I'm going to jump in. We did ascertain that there was a showroom in Ottawa.
Yes, yeah.
That we
Not clear if
recently
they
got.
ever
People are sending us
actually-
stuff in the mail as well, and we have a photo of the Ottawa showroom.
Yeah, which I from what we saw, it looked like it had room for about one car, and certainly no garage space. Let me see here. Peter is wondering, just as a general, since I know we're running a bit short on time, we're coming to the end of our time tonight, wondering about the sort of future of steam technology. Are we ever going to see, do you think, feasible steam cars coming back as anything other than an interesting curiosity?
Well, one wonders, one wonders with global warming and things like that, and the departure of fossil fuels, etc. Is there a way, would there be a way to produce steam, electrically? I don't know about solar, but I don't think in this day and age we should ever say, given the advancements we've seen in the past number of years about autonomous cars, and ironically, there's an autonomous car facility in Stratford, the same place that had a Brooks steam car facility, and they were both supposed to be on the cutting edge of technology. One wonders, whether there may be a place for that at some point in the future, whether cars run on steam or do they run on plutonium like a DeLorean? I don't know.
Well, it's probably worth mentioning that the usual medium they use to turn nuclear power into motive force is boiling water. So every
Right, heavy water.
is a car without wheels.
I just want to find one thing about the question about Ottawa.
Yeah.
In 1924, in a promotional stunt, a Brooks sedan was driven across North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and also across several states, including through Texas and California. So whether or not they sold cars elsewhere, they certainly took them elsewhere, and whether that was to sell them or to get investment for them, history can judge that. But they certainly made their way, and that's no small accomplishment either, in a car that went 35 miles an hour to drive from the Atlantic to the Pacific and then make your way to California and Texas, and then presumably they either sold it to somebody or that it found a home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, I think we're coming right upon 8 o'clock here. We just have a minute or so left. John, do you have any last final words? I see there's still a few questions, but we can follow up with those after the presentation as well. So it's certainly a fascinating subject, but anything else you'd like to add?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the questions. It's quite often I find at the museum, and I visit with a bit of contrition. We have people quite often come to the museum through our printing press or through our agricultural area or our Shakespeare exhibits and festival exhibits, and they come through and they know more about it than we do, which we always see as a terrific resource. And that's been the case here on this call as well, that as much as we've tried to present some information about this, we've learned a few things too. So that's greatly appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us, John. And
Thank
you
you
everyone for sticking with us this evening through our talk. And we'll see everyone back on May 18th. And we're going to be heading out east to talk about Cars of the Maritimes with our next speaker. So thank you, everyone. And we'll leave it at that for this evening.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
And everybody.
Night, everyone.